Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming along today. I'm Philippa McDonald. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This webinar on responding to elder abuse is brought to you by Compass. Compass is the national website connecting people to services and information tackling elder abuse in all its forms. Compass is created by Elder Abuse Action Australia with funding from the federal government's Attorney General's Department. Compass is committed to ensuring equitable and inclusive responses to end elder abuse for everyone affected, including people with diverse characteristics and life experiences. Elder Abuse Action Australia, or EAAA, is the national voice for action to eliminate elder abuse through advocacy, policy development, best practice, and research and capacity building. If you or someone you know needs help tackling elder abuse, go to www.compass.info. There's also the Elder Abuse Helpline. It's free and confidential. 1-800-ELDER-HELP. That's 1-800-353-374. 1-800-353-374. During this session, I urge you and I invite you to ask questions in the chat box. We'd like to get as many as possible. We ask that everyone be respectful and not name or identify people. And please participate in our poll. Today, we'll provide practical information on what to do and where you can go for help. We'll talk about the key resources and services which are available, and we'll provide some guidance on navigating the tricky issues and common mistakes. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure and honour to introduce you to our panellists from all over Australia. Michelle Padbury is Senior Financial Counsellor with Vincent Care, Victoria's Hume Community Hub in Shepparton. She also works as a financial counsellor in Mansfield in Victoria. Michelle has been a financial counsellor for over 19 years. She was part of Dignity and Debt, Financial Difficulty and Getting Older, an initiative which was designed to address the effectiveness of one-on-one financial counselling sessions with older persons, including consumer advocacy and information about financial hardship protections. Sadie Davis works at Justice Connect, a community legal centre. She's the principal lawyer in the seniors law team. Sadie is based at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney, and works in a health justice partnership to provide legal assistance to older patients who are experiencing or at risk of elder abuse. Natasha Short is a descendant of the Jaru people of the Halls Creek community. Natasha's work over the past 25 years has been around community development and investment into social change initiatives. Natasha is the Managing Director of Kimberley Birds, an Indigenous consultant agency based in the Kimberley, which worked on the landmark humbugging report and campaign. Natasha is in a remote part of the Kimberley in Western Australia with little connectivity, but she's going to join us when she can, and she's joining us for this panel discussion initially via a pre-record. Dr. Penny Webster is a specialist in geriatric medicine, working with the Community Acute Post-Care team in Newcastle, which encompasses hospital in the home, the transitional aged care program, rehabilitation in the home, and health at home. Welcome to our panelists. Thanks so much for joining us. And let's start with this video from Natasha Short.
G'day, Jalinda. I'm coming to you from Mirrawong country in Kununurra today. So Kimberley Birds had gathered data regarding the financial abuse of Aboriginal elders in the Kimberley in 2020 on behalf of the Kimberley Community Legal Service. So we found that it's very prevalent across our communities, although people didn't refer to it in that way, they referred to it as humbug, and they knew exactly what it was. It's become so normal that it's no longer considered abuse, and nor is any particular action being taken to address it. And it's actually happening very commonly right now in our communities. The stories that we gathered were alarming and very commonplace throughout our region. So sometimes, because the traditional practice of generosity and giving is so deeply embedded within Indigenous culture and society, it makes it harder for people to actually identify it.
So humbugging is putting older people under pressure to hand over their money.
It is, and it's happening very commonly.
So what are you doing on the ground to respond, and where can people turn to for help?
So unfortunately, since this report was released in December 2020, which at that time, it was the only research piece that we knew about relating to Aboriginal elder abuse, very little has actually been done. It has certainly been promoted to people holding portfolios that are responsible for older Australians, people across our communities that are in that older cohort, but nothing further has taken place. And so it hasn't actually had a lot of traction. So to that end, we're recommending that the resources that Kimberley Birds created are accessed and that people make it their own business to inform themselves, to take action and to support the vulnerable people in our communities. So those resources are free, and they include a report outlining recommendations of what people can do to reduce it, posters, animations, and a staff training manual to identify the issue in a way that they can respond in a cultural and safe manner. So elders can only be supported with their knowledge and permission. So you can work with them in regards to a solution in conjunction with them.
Thanks, Natasha, and we'll get back to you soon. And I'd like to come to you, Michelle Padbury. Please give us an overview of what your service does, how you can access your service, and how financial counsellors can assist someone to respond to elder abuse.
There are approximately 1,000 financial counsellors across Australia. All of them are qualified professionals, and all will offer a free, non-judgmental, confidential service. To talk to a financial counsellor or to find the closest service to you, you can contact the National Debt Helpline on 1800 007 007. That number will take you to a state-based service staffed by financial counsellors. We can also accept third-party referrals, of course, with the client's consent, and self-referrals. With all our clients, we assess their situation. So we look at their income, their expenditure, their assets, and their debts. We consider what suitable options are available, and then we support the clients to achieve the best outcomes for them. In relation to elder abuse, we'd be looking out for red flags, such as being told that someone else has the client's bank card or checkbook, the client not wanting to turn on the heater or cooler as there is not enough money to pay the bill. That people, and unfortunately it's often family members, are staying in the house and they're not contributing to household costs. The client, we might ask the client to provide a credit card statement and they might not be able to provide it because they don't know where it is, or somebody else is opening their mail. We do have to be mindful of not jumping to conclusions, however, but gentle interviewing will often elicit further information. So with the client's consent, we may be able to speak to a trusted family member, a support worker, or the police. In some cases where the abuser is a family member of the client, we sometimes find that the person being abused doesn't wish to change their situation because they would lose contact with, for example, their grandchildren if they called out the abuse. Ultimately, though, it's up to the client on what actions they wish to take.
That's really interesting. And can we just have that phone number again that you mentioned?
The National Debt Helpline, 1800 007 007.
What are some of the outcomes which may surprise people? What's possible with a financial counsellor? You know, sometimes you're coming up against a financial institution, you might feel the odds are stacked against you.
So there are a range of outcomes that are possible to address the debts and the financial abuse. They could be as simple as setting up regular payments via centre pay from a client's pension so that the basic needs are met, such as rent and utilities. It also leaves less money to be pilfered from the client's account. It may be successfully negotiating debt waivers on behalf of the client. And yes, at times it can feel that the major creditors, such as banks and large utility companies, are lacking in compassion, but fabulous outcomes are possible. So here's a quick case study on a piece of work that I did, of which I'm very proud. The client, that we'll call Velma, had managed to leave the abuser, but she was left with a mortgage, no savings, limited superannuation funds, and she found herself having to work casual retail shifts to supplement her Centrelink income. Her ex-partner had had Velma sign documents when he was running a business. She would say, "What are they?" And he goes, "Don't worry, you wouldn't understand." One day she went to the ATM just to get some money out to go and pay for some groceries. She found she couldn't withdraw any money because, well, she didn't know what was going on. So she contacted the bank and found that her account had been frozen. She was told that her account had been frozen because she had liability for several debts relating to her ex-partner's business. When she tried to make a payment on the debt, she was told she was not authorised to make payments, so stymied whichever way she goes. Velma eventually found a way to my service. I commenced negotiations with the bank. After some toing and froing and finding a very sympathetic bank employee, the debt waivers I requested on behalf of the client were successful. So we had a credit card of $1,800 waived, an overdraft on a business account of $11,000 waived, and a business loan of $26,000 waived. Velma said she was floored at hearing that the two large debts had been waived and that she would now be able to sleep at night. Velma said the abuse was like a dripping tap that just creeps up on you and you get used to it.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that outcome. And to describe the abuse like that dripping tap, you know, that it just creeps along and then it gets on top of you, like Velma. Dr. Penny Webster, you describe yourself as the barefoot geriatrician. What exactly do you do and what do you see on the ground when it comes to elder abuse, and how do you respond?
So a geriatrician is a specialist doctor who assists with the complex medical problems of older people, and geriatricians are trained to take a holistic approach. I work embedded within a large community team which is focused on hospital avoidance. General practitioners also refer to me for assessment and management of physical or cognitive problems. I have a clinic. I visit lots of people in their homes, and I also visit residential care. So I find that elder abuse is prevalent in the community. Most commonly, psychological abuse arises in the context of stretched, strained, and exhausted carers who have inadequate supports with family, friends, or services. And so part of my role is to try to remedy that. Financial abuse is also prevalent, and I find that occurs because an older person might not be able to use technology and become dependent on another person to access their money or services. Sometimes accusations of elder abuse can arise from misunderstandings or misinterpretations of a situation, and just occasionally they can be mischievous or vexatious. And so when there's an accusation of elder abuse,
Oh, we've got some tricky
connectivity
there. Sorry, you're coming in and out. Let's try just a little more again. I think everyone's got on their devices.
Okay. So when there's an accusation of elder abuse, it's very important to assess the situation with an open mind, to understand the situation and get the facts straight, it's important to gain the perspective of the older person, who of course remains at the centre. Subjective information and collaborative history can be very helpful, and objective data, so for example, a change in a person's weight due to inadequate access to food or fluids, photographs and recordings taken with the permission of the person can also be extremely helpful as a form of documentation.
Wow. And well, you made the news in 2015 in the case of Brian. This was an extraordinary situation with one of your patients, and he's given permission to speak about his case. Can you tell us about him and how you and others responded?
So Brian was a 77-year-old man when I met him in 2014, and he was actually the only person who's ever been referred to the hospital avoidance program I work with by the police. He was a widower and he'd been living alone for about 10 years. He's really interested in soccer, and he'd volunteered and coached soccer for many years and been awarded. His son was a long-haul truck driver who'd been living with him on and off over the years. Brian was reviewed by a colleague of mine when his son was worried that Brian was having problems with his memory. And this was on a background of diagnoses of diabetes and prostate cancer. Brian was given a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and he was advised, as I often do advise people, to think about organising their affairs. So on that day, his son took him to a solicitor, and his son was appointed as Brian's enduring guardian and enduring power of attorney. Brian's life changed dramatically from that day. He was rarely allowed to leave his home or see his friends. The son's partner, her family and dogs moved into Brian's house. Brian was locked in his room at night and was not allowed access to a toilet. He received separate meals which were served to him in his room. He was not allowed access to the refrigerator. He lost about 25 kilos in weight over time. On pension day, he was escorted to the bank when he withdrew his pension and gave it to his son for his care needs, allegedly. He rarely saw his GP. His medication for his diabetes and prostate cancer was withheld, and Brian was told that he was dying. Brian sought to leave his home to seek help, but his son threatened him and started to destroy his soccer trophies. When he attempted to leave his home, it was framed as wandering. Brian sometimes managed to contact his neighbour by throwing messages over the back fence, and actually managed to smuggle his soccer trophies to the neighbour. The neighbour called the police on numerous occasions, very concerned about Brian and his safety. However, when the police turned up, they were told that Brian was inside for his own safety because he had dementia. And it wasn't until the neighbour called the elder abuse hotline and provided a recording of verbal abuse and threats made to Brian by the son's partner that the police actually
Well, we
acted.
are losing you there. I'm sorry to interrupt here. We've just got a connectivity issue, and we might ask that mobile phones, if they are close to your computer, are turned off. But it's in terms of Brian's case, he was able to get help, and 7 years on, he's still with us.
He is. So he returned to his home with the support of his extended family and friends. His son, the dogs, and the partner, the children were evicted and have AVOs served against them. And he lived in his own home for many years until he's more recently moved into residential care. Charges were laid by the police, and the charge was failure to provide the necessities for life. The couple were found guilty and they were sentenced to a community service order of 144 hours.
Well, look, thank you for that. That's an extraordinary outcome and certainly made history and headlines at the time. Thank you. And Sadie, tell us about Justice Connect and the unique service you have at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney.
Sure, thanks, Philippa. Justice Connect is a community legal centre, and in 2017 we set up what's called a health justice partnership with St Vincent's Health Network in Sydney. And what a health justice partnership does is it's a relationship between the health sector and us as lawyers. We deliver legal services to older patients of the St Vincent's Health Network who are either at risk of or experiencing elder abuse. The focus of the Health Justice Partnership, or the HJP, is to respond to and prevent elder abuse. And the thinking behind an HJP is that responding to elder abuse is most effective when the response is provided by a multidisciplinary team. So the team in the HJP is made up of health workers, including geriatricians, psychologists, social workers, physios, and also the Justice Connect lawyer. And we're embedded in the hospital environment. We've got an office on site at St Vincent's in Darlinghurst, and we attend the hospital case conferences. We work really closely with the social work team.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what are the types of interventions and responses to elder abuse that you can sort of enact in a hospital environment? And you have the story of a patient that we'll refer to as Mary.
Sure. So in terms of types of interventions in the hospital environment, the role of the social workers is key, and we work very closely with the social work staff. Social workers can refer to us as one of a range of options that are open to someone who's experiencing or at risk of elder abuse. So I work with the social workers. They obtain consent from the patient and then they're referred to us. So we can work with the social workers to report issues to the police. Someone can be referred to the older person's mental health service at Vinnie's for psychological assistance. The social worker and we can refer to other community supports so that when someone leaves hospital, they have the support that they need if they need to seek help down the track.
And what were you able to do in Mary's case?
Well, Mary, and that's not her real name. So she came into contact with us via a referral from the social work team at Vinnie's. She'd come into Vinnie's after a fall. She disclosed to the social worker that she had a son, Terry. We'll call him Terry. Terry had returned home after a marriage breakup. And some years ago, Mary had actually appointed Terry as her attorney. So Terry wasn't paying rent. He was drinking heavily. He was gambling. He yelled at Mary and sometimes he pushed her. She was no longer having her friends over and she was spending a lot of time in her room. Mary also told the social worker that she'd recently found out excuse me, that Terry had used the power of attorney to go to the bank and take out a loan in his mum's name. So she found out about this. She asked Terry to repay the loan, and his response was if she continued to ask for the loan to be repaid, she'd never see her grandchildren again. So she told the social worker she didn't want to put her son Terry on the street, but she did want the abuse to stop and she wanted the money to be repaid. So we assisted Mary to revoke the power of attorney, appointing Terry, and to put a new one in place, appointing a friend of hers that she trusted and knew would do the right thing by her. We also gave Mary some advice on taking out an ABO against Terry, and we assisted her in this process of referral to the police. We also told her she could make an application to the family court to see the grandkids, and that we could refer her to one of our pro bono partners. We work very closely with pro bono partners from some of the big law firms, and so we can use that resource to refer our clients to them if they require further assistance. We also told her that if Terry did refuse to repay the loan, we could refer her to one of our pro bono partners, and that pro bono firm would potentially take legal action against Terry and the bank to have the money repaid. So Mary was really happy with those options.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, I think we'll go to a poll now. We had a resounding response to our poll that we had with recognising elder abuse, and 42% of attendees in that webinar indicated they'd been touched by elder abuse, either personally or a friend or family member. And 97% of respondents believed that elder abuse was not widely understood. So we're going to have this poll, and please could I request that you fill it in. It's just 2 questions, and we'll provide the answers in real time. Do you know what options are available in Australia to respond to elder abuse? Yes or no? That's, do you know what options are available in Australia to respond to elder abuse? Yes or no? And the second question is enough being done to respond to the abuse and neglect of older people? Yes or no? Is enough being done to respond to the abuse and neglect of older people? Look, I think that Sadie has really captured the strength of the multidisciplinary approach. And Penny, you touched on this. How tenacious do you have to be in calling out elder abuse and gathering the evidence? You gave some thoughts there, but if you could just touch on that again. You were talking about recordings, photographic evidence. Just step us through there again, if you could.
The answer to that is you have to be extremely tenacious. Some abusers are very adept at throwing up smoke and mirrors, and I'm extremely wary when an older person appears to be sequestered with other people controlling access to the person for reasons which really don't appear to be in the older person's interests. So sometimes you have to be a bit creative to actually gain private access to that person, to allow a opportunity to find out the older person's views about what is actually going on. And so you might, for example, arrange for that person to visit their GP, but they're really there to see you. Or you might send in a nurse, for example, who's there on another pretext.
Right. So, you know, 2 of you might come in, one speaking to each person, the alleged perpetrator and the client or patient. And look, we've got a question in the chat room, so I'd like to open it up to the panel. And that is, when should you get the police involved? Have you got any thoughts, Sadie or Michelle?
It's really up to the client and what the client wants to do. We can't make the client, we could see that that would be a good path to go down, but we can't force the client to do anything like that. We would be encouraging, suggesting, and then supporting them.
And another question that's coming up in the chat is, what do you do if someone is falsely accused of elder abuse? Anyone got any thoughts there? It's all about the evidence, I would say, and people are crying out for resources here. So I would reiterate that the www.compass.info website has a wealth of resources which come from all the agencies that are represented today and more broadly across Australia. And Penny, we'll see how we go with the connectivity, but some diagnoses can cause confusion in families and leave the door open to elder abuse. And you referred to this in the case of Brian. What's the one diagnosis that you think should be handled with great care?
I think there are two. One is a diagnosis of a dementia, which can increase a person's vulnerability to elder abuse. But I'm particularly concerned about the misunderstanding of a medical diagnosis called mild cognitive impairment. And I've actually seen several cases of elder abuse that have arisen in that context. And I just want to emphasise that mild cognitive impairment is not a diagnosis of dementia, but rather indicates that there's been a slight but noticeable decline in memory that's been noticeable to the person and perhaps their close associates, their family, beyond what you might expect. It doesn't meet the criteria for dementia. About 40% of people who have this diagnosis will recover, and about 40% will go on to have a diagnosis of dementia within the next 10 years. So
well, that's very important to note.
A diagnosis of dementia.
And Sadie, I might bring you in here because people are asking these questions, and there's a lot of interest in responding to elder abuse and issues around capacity. And we've even got a question in the chat room about how you deal with non-verbal older people. But if I could have your thoughts, please.
Yeah, so just in terms of why our service works is because a hospital stay is a fairly unique window of opportunity. So it might be the only time that an older person who's experiencing abuse leaves their house. The pandemic has meant that older people have increasingly become more isolated, and they're less likely to access their usual support network. So the hospital stay is a time when an older person is away from the perpetrator of abuse, and they're able to often for the first time talk to health staff, including nurses and doctors, social workers. So for a non-verbal client, we have often worked with speech pathologists within the hospital system to work with that client so that we can get instructions. Part of our role as HJP lawyers is to train health staff on the types and signs of elder abuse, on how to ask effective questions and what to do if elder abuse is suspected. And there's some really good policies within the health system about responding to the abuse of older people. And the policy at St Vincent's highlights the importance of the role of social workers, because they can do a comprehensive psychosocial assessment of the context in which the abuse is occurring. They can include the older person's view of the situation, what their wishes are, which is really key because it's often a family member. And so we just need to tread really carefully in terms of consent and responding. As we know, a significant proportion of abuse is perpetrated by family members, and there's a real reluctance of victims to pursue legal action against family members, which is fair enough. What we do is we try to give an older person information about what legal options are open to them, and they can choose to take that action, or they may do that further down the track.
Yes, and this is something that we'll cover off with Natasha as well. And that is, you might think you know the answers and what's right for an older person who is being subjected to elder abuse. But really, and I'd like your thoughts here, it's up to what they want. They need the agency to be part of any potential solution. And Michelle, could I have your thoughts there of just how critical that is, to have the older person at the centre of any proposed solutions?
It always has to be, because they have to give consent. For example, there's a lot in the chat there about going to the police. we still need the older person to be making the decisions. It is their life. It's their money. There's also people talking about in the chat about basically, if you don't let me live here rent free, you won't see the grandkids again. And in some cases, the person chooses to let them stay there, even though we can see they're being abused. So the client is always at the centre of the decisions made and whatever processes fall out of that.
Yes. And I think this might be a good time to go back to Natasha Short. Let's bring Natasha Short back in here again from the Kimberley.
So our elders are old school. They know very little about technology, and they rely on family members to be able to use things like online resources, online banking, modern technology. So this creates a situation where elders can be easily abused. So living in overcrowded houses, your business is open and it's very hard to keep things private, Philippa. So a traditional mindset does prevail with our older people, and that still continues to inform decision-making. So because our elders prefer face-to-face situations or just human contact, and this includes dealing with staff, it's making it harder in our communities, because in Kununurra alone, which is where I'm living, where we once had 4 banks, we now have 1. So most people in our region are actually using post offices, and also having to rely on, like I said, using family to help them take money out of ATMs now, rather than going into the bank.
That's really tricky, isn't it? If you've got someone over your shoulder when you're getting money out of an ATM.
Yes.
What thought is there to, denominations being dispensed?
Yes. So when I had conducted my research back in 2020, one of the bank managers said they were aware of it already, and they were actually giving their customers smaller denominations, knowing that the person was likely to be humbugged. So giving them the $100 in $5 notes or $10 notes. So when they left the bank, if someone did ask them for money, they'd give away a small amount of money as opposed to a $50 note or a $100 note. So that was a very good, that was a great initiative that person had shown by recognizing elder abuse was there and being able to respond to that in a very real and practical way that was actually helpful to the customer. And that's very great customer service.
And what about at the ATMs? Would you urge the banks to look at dispensing smaller notes?
That would definitely be a fantastic idea. So at the moment, obviously, you'll receive $20 notes, $50 notes, or $100 notes. So if they could make it $10 or smaller, that would certainly be helpful for Aboriginal people.
You had a case of a woman who received a significant amount of money as part of a compensation payout. Tell us what happened with her.
Yeah. So an elder was expecting a large compensation payout, and that's actually a very common thing that happens right across our region. And she was actually working with a financial counsellor that was helping her to develop a budget to determine how that money would be spent once it came into her account, including paying off debts. So when that money was paid, a sum of approximately $50,000, she went to the bank. She was followed by a large group of her family and withdrew all those funds and dispersed it amongst the people that have gone to the bank with her, basically her own family. That's a case of humbugging right there. So when she found out, the financial counsellor returned to that bank to advocate for her client, suggesting to the staff that they had not shown a duty of care to their customer. They should have been able to recognise that she was being humbugged, and that was actually financial abuse. And she was successful in that case, in that bid for her own client, and the bank actually returned that $50,000 back to that elder. And so they were able to proceed with the original budget and where that money had originally been earmarked to be spent. So that's a great outcome.
It is a great outcome. So you're saying that in the space of half an hour in that bank, yes, the whole 50,000 was distributed among family.
It was gone.
But the response was, with the help of a financial counsellor, to advocate for that woman and get the money back.
Yes.
Wow. It can be easy to make assumptions regarding what's right for someone who may be experiencing elder abuse. But how do you make sure that that person is at the centre of the solution and it's what they want?
Exactly. So because elders are often willing to be ill-treated, because they would rather put up with that situation rather than the alternative, which is being alone or not seeing their family, including their grandchildren. So you will definitely need the elders agreement to support them in a way that they think is actually helpful, and to develop an appropriate strategy with them, with their help. So there's 100 ways to do this, okay? So you can just work it out together. A team could come up with some really great innovative strategies, just like the bank manager that I told you about, who's thinking, you know, using his own initiative about what could work in this situation. So people can be very innovative, and they can see solutions at that time when they're dealing with it, when they're working with an older person, and work it out together so that those strategies are actually helpful to the elder as opposed to harmful. So one thing I would also recommend is that you work with a local Aboriginal staff member to help you plan that support so it's safe and it doesn't raise the anxiety of that older person and having to deal with the consequences of whatever strategies you put in place to assist them.
So much work needs to be done, as you've outlined, when it comes to resources to respond to elder abuse culturally. What's at play? And you've covered this. And what's your list for action?
Yeah, so please use the resources that have been created already and that can be found on the Kimberley Birds website, or it's also on the Kimberley Community Legal Services website, because that was the client that had engaged my business to conduct this piece of work. So identifying abuse can be hard because giving and generosity, as I've mentioned earlier, is really closely linked to Aboriginal culture, and the accumulation of wealth and saving money is not a high value priority. So it doesn't have the same meaning as possibly to somebody else. So we're saying increase the financial literacy and competency, and also let's consider how we might be able to establish initiatives that seek to honour and exalt our elders so we can show gratitude for their contribution to our culture and to our society. So what we're suggesting is that can we just start a new narrative about, so we can counteract that current deficit conversation that's playing out right now, that elders don't matter, elders don't count, and they're not entitled to some of these things. So if we can just get on the front foot with some of these, with this particular situation, and begin to address it in a way that we are all holding accountable, being accountable, responsible, and helpful. So it's everybody's issue. It's not just elders alone trying to resolve the situation because they're already vulnerable. How can we be a part of that solution as well?
So thank you very much, Natasha. And I've got Natasha waiting on the line from this remote Kimberley community. And hi, good to see you.
Morning.
That's wonderful.
Thank
and
you.
You've been looking at the chat, and I'm just wondering whether you've got some thoughts on what's going down in the chat and the Q&A.
Yeah, I think all the chats that people are having is all in line with one another and what people are experiencing and seeing in their own communities and stuff. So this is obviously a really big issue, Philippa, right across the country. And to my last point that I just made, how can we come from a strengths-based approach in this situation in regards to this topic and talk about how do we honestly support those elders, and asking them to be a part of those conversations and a part of those solutions there, and making it everyone's business. So it's definitely a big issue, much more bigger than a 1 hour long webinar or conversation here. But there are resources and there are services that are available that can help you with this really sensitive matter. But it's great to see people coming online, wanting to find out more and wanting to be proactive for change.
Exactly. And look, Sadie, I think of the work you're doing and the opportunity to be embedded, to have legal services embedded with vulnerable patients. Is it happening in many other hospitals? What kind of support are you getting? And yes, what's the promise of more services like yours?
Philippa, unfortunately, the service that we provide is just limited to the St Vincent's Health Network. We do get funding from the government, but more is needed to be able to provide a health justice partnership in other parts of Australia. I believe it's a really good way to respond to elder abuse, but the funding is limited.
And just in terms of the education programs for your health workers, what are some of the key notes you're trying to strike? And, you know, are you looking at some kind of internalized ageism in health workers that you're trying to counter? What does the education centre around?
So what it centres around is giving the health workers information on how to identify elder abuse. So what are the types and signs of elder abuse, and what to do if abuse is identified. So referring them back to the policy of the hospital and giving them the confidence to ask those difficult questions. And if something doesn't feel right, to raise it with their social worker and or their manager, and reach out to services like us who can assist their patient to respond to elder abuse in a very effective way.
And look, I might bring you in here, Michelle. I mean, you're shining a light on the financial vulnerability of older people. And what are some of the rights and resources people need to be aware of?
So just talking about financial counselling industry in Victoria, and it's similar in the other states, the peak body, Financial Counselling Victoria, do a lot of activities around financial vulnerability of older people. So they host regular training for financial counsellors and capability workers so that we've all got up-to-date information and skills. They actually facilitate an elder abuse community of practice for financial counsellors. They run initiatives that are such as the project that you mentioned before, one that I was involved in, Dignity in Debt, Financial Difficulty in Getting Older initiative. There's a page on FCVic's website. I'll pop a link into the chat shortly. It's called Older and Wiser, Standing Strong. It does relate to Victoria, but there are some resources there that you can use wherever you are in Australia. And on an individual level, financial counsellors might connect up with agencies who are providing services to older people. So, for example, next week, I'm doing a presentation on financial abuse to the supported home workers in my local area. Personally, I've also visited the local residential aged care facility many times, and I conduct my financial counselling appointments there to make financial counselling visible and accessible. Some financial counsellors specialise in working with older people. So, and we'll always focus on a client's financial and consumer rights. We'll look at their debts to see if they're actually legally owned by the client. And we do look at and participate in systemic sort of advocacy. What sort of rights do people have? Well, they have the right to feel safe. And it's not a simple thing, but some ways that you can help keep yourself financially safe. Don't lend money. Store all your documents, your important documents, your credit cards, your checkbooks securely. Don't sign something if you don't know what it is. Try and stay in touch with people you trust. It could be, as Sadie said, your social worker. It could be a trusted family member. Ask them if you're worried about another person's behaviour towards you. There are supports around, and there's links on that page that I will put a link to, but there's also 1-800-RESPECT, the National Debt Helpline, 1-800-007-007, and I'll pop that in the chat shortly. You can also talk to My Aged Care, which is 1-800-200-422. There's also the Older Persons Advocacy Network, which is 1-800-700-600. So there are a range of resources out there.
Thanks so much for that. And of course, Penny, your team is quite unique as well, isn't it? Do we see many teams, multidisciplinary strike teams that go into people's homes like yours, or are you very much a trailblazer?
I have to say, Philippa, that disappointingly, there aren't very many teams like mine. There are some around, but not many. The siloing of services makes multidisciplinary teams and also, of course, the use of more electronic services, so advice services that are not directly provided to the patient, are becoming more prevalent. So there's an issue here, which I think the other panelists have raised in terms of funding. And you can really do just about anything if you have the funding to do it. With setting up these sorts of teams, which are very effective in assisting people. So I worry that my team is actually under threat in terms of maintaining its funding. So I guess there's more and more interest in terms of providing direct service into the community, as opposed to looking after people in hospitals. So I'm optimistic that there will be more and more services in the future. But however, the funding and the government will has to be there to make it happen.
It's a real call for action and resources, isn't it? Because we have all these wonderful services that you all run here on this panel, and if they were to be expanded, they are best case models of care and interventions and indeed responses to elder abuse. Look, I think I'm dying to find out what the result of this poll is. And here we go. So do you know what options are available in Australia to respond to elder abuse? 73% of you said yes, that's great. And no, 27% of you said no. So that's good. There's a growing awareness of the options available. Is enough being done to respond to the abuse and neglect of older people? Only 8% of you said yes. 92% of you said no, not enough is being done to respond to the abuse and neglect of older people. So there's obviously a deep concern within the community, and I think that we have a very representative sample that not enough is being done. And I just wanted to ask, when we're wrapping up, that if I could ask you all briefly to give a final message, and I'm wondering how Natasha Short's connectivity is going, a final message when it comes to navigating tricky issues and avoiding mistakes. There's so much at stake. Natasha, could we see if we could get you back for this? What would be some of the tricky issues or mistakes that we should avoid?
Oh, look, I think trying to work in silo. So one of the recommendations that we've got in our report is that there is agency collaboration. So working with the stakeholders in your own region who know some of those nuances that are unique to the place that you're working in, and then also using the Aboriginal staff that might be working within those organizations to help them to guide the conversation. Because sometimes people don't know some of the background things that are going on in community that's impacting some of these front things that we're seeing. So just working as much as you can with local people to get those solutions, please.
Those community-led responses, yes.
Community-led response.
And Sadie, can I have your thoughts about navigating tricky issues and avoiding mistakes?
I think elder abuse is a very tricky issue, particularly because the perpetrators are often family members. So the message I try to provide to health workers and to the people I work with is elder abuse is everyone's responsibility. And it's a responsibility not only to recognise elder abuse, but to respond to it effectively. So don't be afraid to ask further questions if things don't feel right. Reach out to health workers and other community supports for help to support your loved one, your neighbour, someone that you're feeling concerned about. and be brave in trying to respond to elder abuse. It's an issue that affects so many of our older people.
And Penny, what would you like to say?
I completely agree with the other panelists. This is a shared responsibility for everybody. You need to maintain your vigilance, be really observant, but be very careful rushing to conclusions, and be really careful about ageism and dementiaism. Act, but be careful to make sure you have your facts straight, to protect people who are falsely accused of elder abuse, and document. It's really, really important.
Yes. And well, then that's a perfect time to bring Michelle
to
in.
document what you're.
Yes. Michelle, what would you say about navigating those tricky issues and avoiding mistakes?
So the elder abuse issue is massive and there's no simple answer. We all have a part to play in trying to address it. If you're the person that's being financially abused, reach out, ask for help. If you're the worker, look for the red flags, such as the client having limited access to their funds, their pension, their bank card, their checkbook, or they might be being pressured to change their will or their power of attorney. So call the National Debt Helpline if you're looking for a financial counsellor, 1800 007 007, or any of those other resources that have been listed in the chat.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists for your time and an illuminating discussion. And thank you, Natasha, for finding the bandwidth to tune in from that remote community. But a very big thank you to our wonderful panelists, Natasha, Sadie, Penny, and Michelle. And if any of these issues have raised concerns with you, we've been getting quite a few numbers that you can get help, but remember also the 1-800-ELDER-HELP, 1-800-353-374, 1-800-353-374. So have these in your armory because this period can be a very difficult one. Compass.info has extensive resources on understanding, preventing and responding to elder abuse, along with comprehensive sections on financial abuse, powers of attorney, grandparent alienation, family agreements, and much more. So that's compass.info. It has just that wealth of information. Now, hundreds of you have joined the panel today. Thousands will join afterwards. It gives you a sense that you're not alone in your concern about responding to elder abuse. Now, to give you some idea of the scale of concern, more than 300,000 Australians have visited compass.info this year, and over 400,000 people have shared stories, liked, commented, and reacted to our national social media campaigns, all aimed at raising awareness of the abuse and neglect of older people, along with helping people find the right information and service providers for their needs. So it really does give you a sense of the scale, and you are not alone. I'll be back in 2023 and we'll kick off our webinars with the misuse of enduring power of attorney. Until then, season's greetings and all the best for 2023. Goodbye.